Jack Abbott stood alone in the dim hush of the Abbott living room as the rain lashed against the windows like 1,000 accusing fingers. The house steeped in a silence so heavy it felt like grief itself had taken physical form. And in his trembling hands lay the letter that would shatter what remained of his faith in family, love, and truth. The last letter Allie'S had ever written, the paper faintly creased, her handwriting soft yet urgent, as if she had known time was running out and every word might be her final breath. And as Jack unfolded it, his chest tightened with a pain so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees, because even before reading a single line he felt it, that terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. "Dear Jack," the letter began, and those 2 words alone broke something open inside him, because she had always called him Jack, never Uncle, never Mr. Abbott, just Jack, as if claiming him not by blood alone but by choice. And her words poured out like a confession whispered in the dark. She wrote of fear that had been stalking her for weeks, of shadows she could not escape, of secrets that were rotting from the inside, of people she loved who were not who they pretended to be. And Jack's breath hitched as he read how she had tried to convince herself she was imagining things, how she had wanted so desperately to believe that family, even a complicated one, could never truly turn monstrous. Yet the deeper he read, the more his hands shook, because Allie spoke of Noah and Sienna in ways that sent a chill through his veins, describing late-night arguments cut short when she entered the room, sudden silences, looks exchanged that felt like knives slicing through her back, and a growing dread that wrapped around her heart until she could barely sleep. She wrote that she had discovered something. She didn't put it plainly, as if even on paper she was afraid to name it, but she hinted at evidence, at a confrontation that went horribly wrong, at voices raised and a moment when she realized she might not walk away alive. And Jack felt tears blur his vision as he read her apology, because she said she was sorry for dragging him into this, sorry for not coming to him sooner, sorry that if he was reading this it meant she had failed to save herself. And the room seemed to tilt as Jack staggered back, the weight of her words crushing him, because Allie had always been so hopeful, so determined to believe in goodness. And for her to sound this afraid meant the danger had been very real. Before he could even process the last line of the letter, the door opened and Matt stepped inside, his face pale, his jaw set with a grim resolve that made Jack look up sharply, instinctively knowing that whatever Matt was about to say would align with the nightmare now unfolding on the page in his hands. And when Matt spoke, his voice was low, strained, as if every word cost him something precious. And he said Jack's name the way people do when they are about to deliver news that can never be taken back, and Jack demanded answers, his voice breaking as he held up the letter and asked if Matt knew what Allie had been talking about, if he knew why she had been so afraid. And Matt closed his eyes for a moment as if bracing himself against the storm he was about to unleash, then told Jack the truth he had uncovered, the truth that would rip Genoa City apart. Matt revealed that Noah Newman and Sienna were not just connected to Allie's disappearance, not just suspects hovering on the edges of a tragic mystery, but her killers. And the word killers echoed in Jack's head like a gunshot, loud and final, and he staggered back as if physically struck, refusing to accept it, because Noah was family, because Sienna had smiled in this very room, because the idea that they could commit something so unforgivable felt impossible, obscene. Yet Matt went on, his voice gaining urgency as he explained how he had followed a trail of lies, how he had pieced together timelines that didn't add up, messages deleted but not erased, witnesses too frightened to speak until confronted with proof. And as Matt spoke, Jack saw flashes of memory collide. Noah's forced calm, Sienna's overly careful concern, the way they had both insisted Allie would turn up. And suddenly those moments twisted into something sinister, something calculated, and Jack's heart pounded as Matt revealed the motive, a desperate attempt to protect a secret that would have destroyed them, a confrontation that escalated beyond control, and a decision made in panic and cruelty that ended Allie's life. Jack's grip tightened on the letter as he reached the final lines, where Allie wrote that if anything happened to her, Jack must not let the truth die with her, that he must be strong even when it felt impossible, because monsters only win when good people look away. And those words ignited a fire inside him even as his world collapsed, because grief and rage surged together until he could barely breathe, and he demanded to know where Allie was now. Demanded to know how Noah and Sienna could live with what they had done, demanded justice for the young woman whose life had been stolen before it truly began. Matt told him the authorities were closing in, that evidence was being secured, that the walls were finally caving in on Noah and Sienna, but Jack barely heard him, because all he could see was Allie as she had been, laughing, hopeful, full of plans. and all he could feel was the devastating knowledge that he had failed to protect her, that the family she trusted had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. And as the rain outside intensified, it felt like the world itself was mourning. Genoa City poised on the edge of a reckoning that would expose the darkest corners of its most powerful families, and Jack sank into a chair, clutching Allie's letter to his chest like a lifeline, tears finally spilling over as a guttural sob tore free, because this letter was not just a goodbye, it was a weapon of truth, a final act of courage from a young woman who refused to be erased, and Jack knew in that moment that he would honor her, no matter the cost, that he would face Noah, face Sienna, face anyone who tried to bury this truth, because Allie's voice would not be silenced, not now, not ever. And as thunder rolled overhead like a promise of judgment, Jack Abbott rose from his grief with a resolve forged in heartbreak, ready to unleash a storm of justice that would leave no lie standing and no killer unexposed. The night deepened into something almost unreal as Jack Abbott stood at the threshold of the Abbott mansion, the echo of Allie's last words still reverberating in his mind like a relentless drumbeat, and with every breath he took it felt as though he was inhaling shards of glass, because grief had now fused with purpose, and there was no turning back from what was coming next. Not after Matt's revelation had ripped the final veil away from the truth, not after the letter had transformed from a farewell into a summons for justice, and as Jack straightened his shoulders he felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. The Abbotts had survived scandals, betrayals, wars both corporate and personal, but this was different, because this time the blood spilled was innocent, and it belonged to someone who had trusted him, believed in him, loved him, and that made the pain sharper, more personal, more unforgiving. Matt followed Jack into the study, closing the door behind them as if sealing them inside a confessional where no lie could survive, and under the warm glow of the desk lamp Jack spread out the evidence Matt had brought. Phone records, timestamps, photographs taken from a distance that showed Noah and Sienna together at hours they had sworn they were apart, and each piece clicked into place with sickening clarity, forming a picture so damning that denial became impossible. And Jack's hands trembled not with uncertainty but with barely restrained fury, because the people who had smiled at him, who had spoken Allie's name with false concern, had been acting out a grotesque performance while knowing she lay cold and silent because of them. Jack demanded every detail, not because he doubted Matt, but because he needed to understand how love could curdle into violence so completely, and Matt told him about the confrontation, about how Allie had discovered a secret linking Noah and Sienna to a crime far older than her own death, something that would have destroyed careers, reputations, and entire legacies, and when Allie confronted them she had expected fear, maybe denial, maybe even remorse, but instead she was met with desperation so fierce it became lethal, and Jack closed his eyes as Matt described raised voices, a struggle, a moment that went too far, because in that moment Jack could see it all too clearly, Allie's courage colliding with their terror and terror winning. Outside, Genoa City slept unaware that its fragile illusions were about to be shattered, but inside the Abbott house a war council was forming, and Jack knew this could not be handled quietly, not buried under settlements or softened by influence, because if the truth was compromised now, Allie would die a second time, erased by convenience and power, and Jack swore aloud, his voice hoarse and raw, that this would not happen, not on his watch, not ever. As dawn crept closer, Jack made calls he never wanted to make, summoning allies who understood what was at stake, people who would not flinch when the names Newman and Sienna were spoken, and when the sun finally rose it cast a cruel light on a city about to awaken to scandal, betrayal, and blood, because word began to spread in hushed whispers that something terrible was coming, something that could not be contained, and at Newman Enterprises, Noah felt it before he heard it, a tightening in his chest, a sense of impending doom that no amount of denial could silence, while Sienna paced her apartment like a trapped animal, replaying that night over and over, telling herself it had been an accident, telling herself there had been no other choice, yet every mirror reflected the same truth she refused to face, that guilt does not fade, it festers, and it always demands its price. The first crack came when the police reopened Allie's case with renewed urgency, detectives asking questions they hadn't asked before, looking at Noah and Sienna not as grieving friends but as potential suspects, and panic spread between them like wildfire, their once united front splintering as fear turned them against each other, because secrets are only safe when shared, and now each wondered who would break first, who would save themselves by sacrificing the other. Meanwhile, Jack sat across from Diane, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him, and told her everything, watching as horror drained the color from her face, because Allie had been her redemption, her second chance. And the knowledge that she had been murdered by people she trusted shattered Diane in a way no accusation ever could. Yet even through her tears she stood with Jack, because this was no longer about old rivalries or past mistakes. It was about honoring a life stolen too soon. The media caught the scent of blood quickly, headlines exploding with speculation, and as cameras gathered outside Newman Enterprises the city held its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. And when Jack finally stepped forward, Allie's letter clutched in his hand like a sacred text. His words cut through the noise with devastating clarity, because he did not speak as a businessman or a rival, but as a man mourning a daughter of the heart, and he promised that justice would be pursued without mercy or compromise, that Allie's voice would be heard even if it meant tearing down the most powerful names in Genoa City. The pressure became unbearable for Noah, who found himself cornered by memories he could no longer outrun, Allie's face haunting him in moments of silence, her courage a mirror reflecting his cowardice, and as the net tightened he began to crack, his anger flaring at Sienna, accusing her of pushing things too far, while she shot back that he had been just as complicit, just as responsible, and their arguments grew more volatile, more desperate, because guilt seeks escape, and betrayal often becomes its final form. The breaking point came late one night when sirens wailed in the distance and Sienna realized the end was no longer theoretical, and in a moment of raw terror she considered running, leaving everything behind. But even that fantasy collapsed under the weight of inevitability, because there are some crimes you can never truly escape, and when the police finally arrived, warrants in hand, the silence that followed was deafening. Genoa City frozen in shock as the truth spilled out in brutal detail, and as Noah was led away, his eyes met Jack's across a crowded room, and in that instant Jack saw not a monster, but a broken man who had made an unforgivable choice, and that realization brought no comfort, no closure, only a deeper ache, because nothing could bring Allie back. Yet even in the aftermath, as tears, rage, and regret flooded every corner of their lives, Jack held on to one unshakable truth. Allie had not died in silence, she had left a legacy of courage, and through her final letter she had ignited a reckoning that would change Genoa City forever. And as Jack stood at her grave, the earth freshly turned, he vowed that her story would not end here, because justice, once awakened, does not sleep, and the consequences of that night would ripple outward, shaping destinies, destroying illusions, and proving that even in a city built on secrets, the truth, no matter how painful, always finds its way into the light. The funeral was over, the mourners gone, yet the air around Allie's grave still vibrated with unfinished business, because death may close a life but it never closes the truth, and Jack Abbott felt that truth pressing against his spine as he stood alone beneath a sky bruised with gray clouds, the soil still dark and raw like an open wound, and in that moment he understood that this was not the end of Allie's story but the ignition point of something far more devastating, because justice in Genoa City never arrives cleanly, it arrives dragging secrets, collateral damage, and shattered legacies in its wake, and as Jack turned away from the grave he felt eyes on him, unseen but heavy, the city watching, waiting, whispering, already choosing sides. The arrest of Noah and Sienna had detonated like a bomb, sending shockwaves through every corner of Genoa City, and the fallout was immediate and merciless, because the Newmans had built their empire on power and control, not public shame. And now their name was being dragged through headlines splashed with words like murder, betrayal, and cover-up, while Victor Newman stood behind the closed doors of his office, fists clenched, fury simmering beneath a mask of iron resolve, because this was not just a legal crisis, it was a personal affront, an attack on the myth of invincibility he had spent a lifetime cultivating, and yet even Victor could not rewrite evidence, could not silence a letter written by a dead girl whose courage outweighed his influence. Nikki wept in private, torn between loyalty and horror, because Noah was family, but Allie's blood cried out from the ground, and no amount of love could justify what had been done, while Sharon was shattered in a different way entirely, her maternal instincts warring with the unbearable knowledge that the boy she had raised had crossed a line from which there was no return, and every memory of Noah's childhood now felt poisoned, rewritten through the lens of that final fatal choice. In holding cells that smelled of disinfectant and despair, Noah and Sienna sat apart, separated not just by steel bars but by the realization that whatever bond had driven them to protect each other that night was now ashes, because fear had stripped away loyalty, and what remained was blame, raw and corrosive. Noah replaying Allie's last moments on an endless loop, her voice raised not in hatred but in disbelief. as if she truly could not comprehend that people she trusted would choose violence over truth, and Sienna haunted by the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears after it was over, the awful silence that followed, the moment she knew there was no undoing what they had done. Interrogations began, relentless and surgical, detectives laying out timelines and contradictions with chilling precision, and every time Allie's name was spoken it sliced through Noah like glass, because this was no longer abstract, no longer something that could be buried under rationalizations. It was real, it was public, and it was permanent, and when Sienna finally broke, her confession spilling out in sobs and gasps, she tried to frame it as an accident, a moment that spiraled, but even as the words left her mouth she knew how hollow they sounded, because accidents do not require lies, cover-ups, and calculated silence, and the truth, once cracked open, refused to be contained. Jack followed every development with a focus so intense it bordered on obsession, because grief had sharpened him into something relentless, and while part of him longed to retreat, to mourn in private, a larger part knew that retreat would dishonor Allie's courage, and so he stood firm as subpoenas flew and alliances shifted, watching as people he had known for decades revealed who they truly were when the stakes became unbearable, some offering quiet support, others recoiling in fear, desperate not to be pulled into the undertow of scandal. And through it all, Jack clutched Allie's letter like a compass, returning to her words whenever doubt crept in, reminding himself that she had anticipated this chaos, that she had trusted him to navigate it when she no longer could. Diane unraveled and reassembled herself in the same breath, grief carving deep lines into her face but resolve straightening her spine, because this was her daughter, her miracle, her chance at redemption, and she would not allow Allie to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's downfall. And together she and Jack planned a foundation in Allie's name, a promise that her legacy would be more than tragedy, that it would stand for truth, protection, and the courage to speak even when silence feels safer. The courtroom became a theater of reckoning, packed with reporters and spectators hungry for every tear, every tremor, and when Jack took the stand, the room fell silent because he did not speak with theatrical rage. He spoke with quiet devastation, describing Allie's kindness, her integrity, her fear, and the letter she had written knowing it might be read only after her death. And as he read her words aloud, even the most hardened faces in the room softened, because Allie's voice transcended the legal arguments, cutting straight to the heart of what had been lost. Noah avoided Jack's gaze until the very end, when their eyes finally met and something unspoken passed between them, not forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition of irrevocable damage, and in that moment Noah understood that no sentence the court could impose would ever match the weight of what he carried inside. Because prison has walls but guilt has none. Outside the courthouse, Genoa City reeled, friendships fractured, trust eroded, and the myth that power could shield anyone from consequence lay in ruins, while younger generations watched and learned that even golden names could fall, that truth, once unleashed, does not discriminate. When the verdict finally came, it landed with a dull, heavy finality, and as Noah and Sienna were led away to face the rest of their lives defined by one terrible night, Jack did not feel triumph, only a deep aching sorrow, because justice had been served, but justice does not heal, it only acknowledges the wound. In the weeks that followed, life attempted to resume its rhythm, but nothing felt the same because absence leaves an echo, and Allie's absence was everywhere, in the quiet moments, in the choices people made, in the way conversations stopped when her name was mentioned, and yet there was also a strange, fragile sense of clarity, because her death had stripped away illusions, forcing everyone to confront who they were when confronted with truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Abbott living room in gold and shadow, Jack placed Allie's letter in a frame and set it on the mantel, not as a relic of pain but as a reminder of courage, and as he stood there, breathing in the stillness, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the beginning, a quiet promise of forward motion, not forgetting, not moving on, but carrying her with him into whatever came next, because Genoa City was already shifting, new secrets stirring beneath the surface, new alliances forming in the wake of devastation, and Jack knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this chapter, born of blood and truth, was only the beginning, because in a city built on lies one brave voice had cracked the foundation, and from those cracks consequences and new destinies would inevitably rise.